Hello class. Today we're going to talk about multiply and divide integers. So if you remember from yesterday, we did talk about add and subtract. Okay, so there were a few things that I wanted you to kind of remember about that. So let's just review real fast, because sometimes we do get our addition rules and our multiply rules mixed up. So we need to remember, in addition, how do we know that it's an addition problem? Well, we know it's an addition problem because it's got a plus in the middle. And if it's got a plus in the middle, then we've got two rules. If the signs are alike, we're going to add our numbers and keep the sign. If our signs are different, a positive and a negative, then we're going to subtract our numbers and take the sign of the number with the largest absolute value. Now, if it's a subtraction problem, we know it starts with a minus in the middle. That's how we recognize it. And in a subtraction problem, such as 4 minus 9, we're going to start by changing the subtraction sign to an addition sign. So this changes, and the very next number to its opposite. So we do keep, change, flip, okay? Or just change, flip is what I want you to understand. Now the problem is addition, so we go back to our add rules. If the signs are alike, we add. If the signs are different, we subtract. So in this particular case, we would subtract and end up with a negative 5, because the 9 is the number that has the greatest absolute value. So that's what we had to remember about add and subtract. Well, today we're going to talk about multiply and divide. So why do we talk about this? Well, because one of the standards that we have to deal with is add, subtract, multiply, and divide rational numbers fluently. Well, the integers are part of the set of rational numbers. So that's why we have to do this. So let's first kind of review our addition rules. Okay, with a little summary of a chart. I know we just talked about them, but I want to kind of shrink them down even further. Okay, so we have a little chart that looks something like this. And what I'm going to put on the top of this side of the chart is signs on problem. Okay, the signs on the problem. And over here we're going to talk about it as operation. What do we actually do with our problem? Okay, so if I've got two numbers in my math problem and we're only thinking about an addition problem, so in other words, it's a problem that's got a plus in the middle. If my first number is a positive number and my second number is a positive number, what am I going to do with those numbers? Well, we just reviewed, we're going to add them. Well, if my first number is a positive number but my second number is a negative number, what are we going to do with our numbers? So if our signs are different, we're going to subtract. Well, what if it were just the opposite of that? What if the first number were negative and the second number were positive? What are we going to do? Well, we're going to subtract our numbers again. Now, what if my first number is negative and my second number is negative? Well, if they were alike, we're going to add them. So what this says basically is that if our signs are alike, positive, positive, negative, negative, then I'm going to add my numbers together. If my signs are different, then we're going to subtract. So that's exactly what these rules right here said to do. Now, if it's a subtraction problem, we know we're going to change it, and then it turns into an addition problem. So we come back to these rules. So this chart's going to come back to us in just a few minutes, so just hold on to it just for a second. So now let's talk about multiplication. Now, I don't mean this problem to be an insult, but I do want to talk about what does 2 times 3 really mean? Well, back in elementary school, when we talked about multiplication, it meant that we had two groups of 3. Well, now we got to think about it in terms of this is two groups of what kind of 3? Well, it's a positive 3. So if I had two groups of positive 3, there's one group, and here is a second group. How many do we have total? Well, we have positive 6. Okay, we've got 6 and each of those are positive. So that tells me that a positive 2 times a positive 3 gives me a positive 6. So if 2 times 3 means two groups of positive 3, what would 4 times 5 mean? 4 groups of positive 5. Okay, so if I had 4 groups of positive 5, now I'm not going to pull those out, but if I had 4 groups of positive 5, we would end up with a positive 20. So again, a positive times a positive gives me a positive answer. Okay, so let's look at another one real quick that goes along with the 2 times 3 idea. So here's our next one. Okay, so I've got 2 times negative 3 this time. Okay, so if the first one said I've got two groups of positive 3, this one says I've got two groups of negative 3. So if I were to pull out two groups of negative 3, what will that give me? Well, that gives me negative 6. So a positive 2 times a negative 3 gave me a negative 6. Okay? So what if I gave you negative 2 times 3? Well, what we got to think about is this negative in the front actually means I want the opposite of. Okay, so if without the negative, it says 2 groups of positive 3. This negative in front says I want the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3. And the opposite of 2 groups of positive 3 would be 2 groups of negative 3. And 2 groups of negative 3 gives me negative 6. So a negative 2 times a positive 3 gives me a negative 6. Okay, we got one last question to go over. Well, what about this one? Okay, so again, if this negative in the front says give me the opposite of, this says I've got 2 groups of negative 3. What's the opposite of 2 groups of negative 3? 2 groups of positive 3. And 2 groups of positive 3 gives us positive 6. So a negative times a negative equals a positive. So if we go back and review what we just talked about, a positive times a positive gives me a positive answer. A positive times a negative gives me a negative answer. A negative times a positive gives me a negative answer. And a negative times a negative gives me a positive answer. Well, if you really pay close attention to those signs, all that is this chart. A positive and a positive make a positive. But in addition, it talks about operation, but in multiplication, it talks about the sign on the answer. So a positive times a positive is a positive, but a positive times a negative gave me a negative. And a negative times a positive also gave me a negative, but a negative times a negative gave me a positive. So in essence, we have 2 basic rules when we're dealing with multiply. There's 2 basic steps that I want you to understand. Okay, and the first step that we're going to do is we're just going to multiply. We're just going to multiply, and we don't need to pay any attention to the signs. We just multiply, and that's it. Okay, the second thing, what you're going to do is you're going to count your negative signs. Just the negative signs, not the positives. We don't care about the positives. We only care about negatives. When you count your negative signs, if you have an even number of negative signs, your answer is going to be positive. So if we were to go back to that chart, an even number, we had 2 of them here, that's an even number. We ended up with a positive answer. Okay? But if you have an odd number of negative signs, your answer is going to be negative. So if I have 1 negative in my problem, it's negative. 2 or 3 negatives, it's going to be negative. 5 negatives, it's going to be negative. But if I have 6 negatives, the answer is going to be positive. Let's see if we can answer a few questions and play with that rule a little bit. Now, this is a new way of looking at multiplication. Anytime we have a number right up next to a parenthesis, that means that we're going to multiply. So here we've got 4 times negative 6. Well, the steps say, step number 1, multiply. So we're just going to multiply. 4 times 6 is 24. Okay, step number 2 says, count your negatives. Count how many negative signs you see. Okay, so in this particular problem, I have 1 negative sign. So that means my answer is going to be negative. Okay? Second one says we got 3 times 6 times 2, and they're all negative. So 3 times 6 gives me 18. 18 times 2 gives me 36. How many negatives you see? Well, these 2 negatives go together to make a positive. But this 1 negative here, it's left out in the cold, makes the whole thing negative. Okay? Now, the third question. We multiply. 5 times 3 is 15. 15 times 2 is 30. 30 times 1 is 30. We count our negatives. We've got 1 negative here and 1 negative here. 2 negatives make a positive. This 2 and this 5, we just don't care about. They're already positive. They're already happy. We leave them alone. So we end up with a positive 30. Now the last one here, we've got a bunch of 1s. So the way you say this really fast would be negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times 1 times negative 1. So if you put all those 1s together, we know it's just 1. Okay, now we count the negatives. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 negatives, that's even. So that is a positive 1. If I had 1 more negative, it would make the whole thing negative. Okay, so that's half our lesson. Multiplying integers. And we've learned that there's 2 basic steps. Multiply your numbers, count your negative signs. The nice thing about division, because we also have to talk about division, there's only one word that we change in this setup. And that is, instead of multiply, we're going to divide. It's the same exact rule. You divide your numbers, and then you count your negative signs. So let's do a couple just to see how you do. So the first question here says negative 25 divided by 5. So the first thing we do is divide. 25 divided by 5 gives me 5. There's one negative, so my answer is negative. 45 divided by negative 9. Well, 45 divided by 9 gives me 5 also. One negative, so my answer is negative. Negative 36 divided by negative 4. Well, 36 divided by 4 is 9. Two negatives make it positive. Now this next question, I threw some order of operations at you. So the first thing you have to do is the parentheses. So we do the 26 plus negative 4. Well, in addition, we ask ourselves the question, are they alike or are they different? Well, my signs are different, so I subtract. 26 take away 4 gives me 22. And now I'm going to divide that by negative 11. So 22 divided by 11 gives me 2. I have one negative, so my answer is negative. Now we also need to understand that in algebra, this division sign, just like the x in times, is going to go away. So this last question, this is how division will look in algebra. Negative 54 over 6. So anytime you see a fraction, it's just a division problem. So we do the math. 54 divided by 6 gives me 9. I have one negative, so my answer is negative. So in multiply divide, we basically just have two little steps. You either multiply or divide your numbers, just like you've done since 2nd and 3rd grade. And then you count your negative signs. If you have an even number, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, negative signs, your answer is going to be positive. If you have an odd number, 1, 3, 5, 7, your answer is going to be negative. And that's all there is to multiplying and dividing integers. Until next time.